So, thank you all for joining tonight's lecture. My name is Paula, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the lecture committee. For those who are not familiar with us, the lecture series is our monthly lectures run by the students that aims for creating a space for critical debates, thinking the field of design, art, and architecture by bringing in diverse perspectives. Most importantly, we look at how to bridge our practices and the current and ongoing social discourses. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker, Priya Swami. Priya is a curator of globalization and South Asia at the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands. Her practice centers around the movement of Indian labor diaspora into Suriname and Suriname into the Netherlands. So focusing on the everyday narratives of community stakeholders, Priya is committed to a critical, multidisciplinary, and globally focused approach to studies of Hindu identity, Indian material culture, and migration. Tonight's lecture, titled Can the Revolution Be Institutionalized? Curating Collections and Equitable Futures, aims at opening a discussion around the role of institutions in the activism around decolonization, anti-racism, and anti-fascism. Before we start, a few things. This lecture is recorded. It will be shared afterwards. Feel free to leave your camera on with the mic off. We will have a Q&A session in the end. And without further ado, please welcome Priya Swami.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paula. One, for extending the invitation, and two, for taking the care to do tech runs and to make sure everything is great and to do promotion. I'm very excited to join your series tonight. I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Here we go. All right. Can we see this? Paula, can you be my eyes and ears and tell me if you can't see it? So today my discussion is really going to pull from my own curatorial practice and my own research interests, which I'll get into a little bit later. And I'm going to work through and talk through with you today images and events that are close to me and that I kind of have a specific relationship to. I am a Canadian-raised, British-born South Asian woman who's been working in academic and museum-based institutions for a good part of my life. We'll leave it at that. And what I'd like to do, if possible, is when we have a discussion, is get a sense of how I'm thinking through these kinds of issues around curating, how they might relate to a community who's thinking about design. Because I feel like I'm the kind of institution that exhibits the kinds of things that you all are going to make and create, right? And so there is a relationship between our types of institutional affiliation. So that might be an interesting way to sort of kick off discussion. Before I get sort of really into the topic today, what I want to do is just give you a very brief overview of where I work so you get a sense of where I'm coming from. So the National Museum of World Cultures is actually an umbrella organization that came together in 2014. And it was the coming together of all of the different ethnographic collections in the Netherlands. So that includes the Museum Volkenkunde, which is in Leiden, the Tropenmuseum, which is in Amsterdam, the Afrika Museum, which is in Bergendal, and we're also partnered with the World Museum in Rotterdam. What's interesting is that all of them are what we would call ethnographic collections, but they all have a different kind of, let's say, view on the world, or came together in a different way. Museum Volkenkunde is often considered a museum that's closely related to the universities. So a lot of the collections that we have are based on field work that anthropologists and scientists would do and bring their objects back. And then that forms the basis of the collection. Certainly for the South Asia collection, which I am sort of in charge of caring for, that's how it came in. The Tropen Museum was the former Tropical Institute. So this is really the colonial museum par excellence. So this was really about displaying the wealth of, and the wealth and cultures really, of former Dutch colonies at the time to an audience here. So people understand what life is like over there, and also in a sense justifying the whole kind of colonial project. In 1950, right, so after the independence of Indonesia, the Tropa Museum begins to think about collecting other places. And that's when a lot of collections, for example, from South Asia, start to be built up in a Tropa Museum context. Now, the Africa Museum in Bergendal is a missionary collection. So it was a museum set up by the Paters. So that, of course, has a certain kind of angle, right, in what you see. And this was about sort of collecting cultures that at the time people thought, well, with the advent of Christianity and missionary work, might not actually exist in, in the future. The World Museum is really a museum coupled with the harbor. So this was about trade. So this was a lot of times people who were working as traders who would come back with objects that formed the basis of the Rotterdam collection. All right. So that's just sort of the idea of the space wherein I'm working. And the Ethnographic Museum is very much a museum that is concerned with, let's say, the everyday work of anthropology. So it is really about displaying, or it has been historically about displaying other cultures, right? And we know now in this moment that we are thinking and rethinking and working with and reckoning with the history of ethnographic institutions to come up with an idea of what they might mean or how they might be valuable in the world today. And one of the ways in which I want to think through this is through this question about the relationship between social change, the active social change that's happening, and the history of the museum. So I want to start with a provocation that I came up with, and this is that ethnographic museums cannot productively respond to critique and social change unless they reimagine their relationship to time, among other things. So today I really want to talk about this issue of time, to really get into what it is that time, how time is functioning, let's say, in the Ethnographic Museum on one hand, and how it's functioning in movements across social change, particularly anti-racist activism today. So I mobilize protest movements like Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, also to decolonize the museum and decolonize this place, because I think that they are really pushing institutions like ethnographic museums to confront their history, but also to rethink its place and its value in the future. And I think what strong activism and critique is actually asking the museum to do is not necessarily something that seems intensely difficult, but it does require quite a lot of historical kind of insight. And it also requires, I think, a little bit of thinking humbly. And that is about how to position the museum. And if the museum itself is an archive that is embedded in specific notions of colonial and racialized time, how can we in the institution stand beside activism and critique that is by its very nature calling for immediate responses? And this idea of racialized time, I want to think through with you in a little bit. So let's just kind of park that. But let's think about this idea of positioning oneself in the museum and what that means. Because I think there are two concepts that help to understand what a repositioning of the museum might look like and relates to what is being demanded, I think, by a lot of activism and critique today. And the first concept that's really interested to think through is the notion of implicatedness. And I take this from the historian Michael Rothberg, who's writing in 2019, where implicatedness addresses the reality that subjects are, and here I'm quoting him, they're folded into events that at first seem beyond our agency as individual subjects. And what is more, this implicatedness relates to institutions and assemblages of power and privilege that a subject may or may not be aware of. And I think coupled with this notion of understanding your implicatedness in certain kinds of power and privilege is the notion of adjacency that comes up with the Black feminist theorist Tina Camp's work, where she's writing in 2019. And she argues that adjacency demands that we take seriously the subject positions and lived realities that allow people to, let's say, stand beside those whose lives, stories, and experiences and cultures that we value. So she uses this concept of adjacency through a specific example. So she interjected actually into a critique that arose when the New Zealand and Fijian artist Luke Willis Thompson created the artwork Auto Portrait in 2017. And that piece of work featured Diamond Reynolds, who was the partner of Philando Castile. And Diamond Reynolds had witnessed his brutal murder and had live broadcasted it to Facebook. And Thompson was heavily critiqued for fetishizing Black suffering. But Tina Camp actually urged people to take his work and his position as one of adjacency, given that, and this is a quote from Tina Camp, given that it is the adjacency of indigeneity and diasporic formation linked by a vicious history of imperialism and colonization that tethers Black subjects to Pacific Islanders. So unlike solidarity that can often kind of clumsily appropriate and fetishize experiences of trauma, pain, and injustice, adjacency is actually about knowing the implicatedness, first of all, of one or one's position, and then standing beside or alongside those different positions. And I think at the museum, and this may be, personally also for me, it's very important to know that the first step is sort of understanding one's implicatedness in these histories of racist thinking, in the history of colonialism, and then moving to stand adjacent to, because the institution in which we are working is so fundamentally built up differently. It has a different view of reality than a lot of the work of activism and social change, that they cannot easily be mapped onto each other, but there is the possibility for adjacency. And as we go through, I want to talk through these possibilities for adjacency, especially when we're talking about anti-racist, anti-fascist protests and calling for more equitable futures through the museum. So let's get into time. I'm thinking a lot about time, not just because I am in the museum, but I'm thinking about the activism that we're seeing around us here in the city, but also globally. And to me, that really smacks of a certain sense of immediacy and sort of momentariness. And I want to open with actually a line from a Terrence Hayes poem. He's an African-American poet writing now. And I think that it really kind of succinctly and profoundly sums up why many kinds of people feel uncomfortable and out of place in the museum, because they kind of get the hang of the logic of time that relegates some cultures, practices, and peoples and places as eternally backwards as you have it in the museum. So time, and specifically the idea of lateness, really anchors my provocations today. Because of course I've just mentioned this friction, but if we look at the two images that I have on this slide, I think this is something that's also very illustrative of this kind of friction, or this idea of not being able to get the hang of how on earth the museum is thinking about time. On the bottom slide, you have Black Lives Matter protests in the Dam in Amsterdam, and at the top slide is a picture of our Southeast Asia permanent gallery in the Tropen Museum. As you can see, one is very neatly proportioned, right? So the display case has a specific way of proportioning time and relegating time in a way that kind of keeps it in, let's say, well, quite literally a box. And you see all of that kind of spilling out in the immediacy of protests. And so you think, how can the two ever be mapped onto each other? And this is where I come to this notion of racialized time that I brought up. And I want to sort of introduce this as a theoretical premise and introduce this and provoke to say that the Ethnographic Museum operates under a sort of logic of racialized time, right? So in thinking through this, I'm sort of massaging the shoulders of two giants. And one is the psychiatrist and philosopher Franz Fanon. And the second is the philosopher Alia al-Saji, who does a very temporal reading of Franz Fanon's writing in Black Skin, White Masks and his work on race and blackness. So Alia al-Saji argues that racialized, especially Black bodies, are seen as arriving too late, quote unquote, to imagine worlds where there is no, and here I'm quoting her work, coexistence in a lived presence upon which reciprocity could be built. So coexistence here, in my interpretation, refers to an absent yet dominant white other to which the Black racialized body and subject will never be able to catch up due to their limited capacity to progress. So Franz Fanon in his work lays out how, through his own experience of his body, these Black bodies are relegated to a specific place in history. When he is racialized as Black, he sees this as being immediately entangled with the stereotyped histories and fantasies that are projected onto his body. And he says in his work, quote, I was responsible not only for my own body, but also for cannibalism, backwardness, fetishism, racial stigmas, slave traders. And he reflects on his own position as an educated cosmopolitan Black man in kind of the same way, and asserts that his quote unquote development is always in relationship to European and white hierarchies of civilization and progress. And given that his body will always be tied to sort of fantasies of Black histories as underdeveloped or undeveloped and savage, he finds it is, quote, too late for his body. And he says, you have come to the world too late, much too late. There will always be a world, a white world between you and us. That impossibility on either side to obliterate the past once and for all.
What are you doing?
So I would suggest that in racial hierarchies of bodies and their histories, that non-white bodies are all in some way seen as arriving too late in a racializing of histories and time that is a structuring logic, which motivates actually the ways that other cultures are exhibited, displayed, collected, and cared for in the Ethnographic Museum. The museum seeks to locate cultures and peoples on a linear and discrete timeline in order to fossilize its practices and imagines its progress in relationship to a white, Europeanized notion of civilization, success, and even aesthetics. And here we go back. This is what you see again in the display case if I return back to this. So very much on the other hand, right, the work of anti-racist protest movements and activism seeks to turn this notion of racialized time on its head as part of its work. A large part of anti-racist activism is in of itself a refusal to accept the linear temporal logic that sees certain bodies as civilizationally late and therefore inferior, and as a result have been subject to any number of inequities or inhuman treatment at everyday and also institutionalized and structural levels, right? So the very acts of anti-racist protests are themselves against the notion of civilizational and fossilizing time that exists in the museum. In that activism is immediacy, but an immediacy that is born out of a sustained feeling of exhaustion, if that makes sense. I think there is another element to what's happening with the social change movements, with anti-racist and anti-fascist protests that are happening today. You just need to look at how, on the one hand, maybe mass mainstream media covers these kinds of movements, and then speak to the people who are actually involved in them themselves. Because you often hear about the energy, the momentum of the movement, and then when you talk to people who are doing the protest, it comes out of a sense of being so sick and tired and so exhausted by having to do this constantly, right? So there is this kind of, what I'm saying, conflicting sense of realities in terms of times that's happening in the museum, and also for people's realities who are involved in anti-racist protesting. One thing that I think is really interesting, and I just want to bring this to an example from 2013 in Canada, right? So that's close to my context, having grown up in Canada, was the Idle No More movement, right? Which is protests in Canada against the treatment of the mistreatment and the inhuman treatment of indigenous peoples and structural issues related to that in Canada. So the notion of idol itself is really interesting, and it's multi-layered because in the historically racist representations of indigenous peoples, they're often seen as being traditional or stuck in time, i.e. sort of idle in the racialized trajectory of time. So I think that it's particularly interesting, significant, and poignant that the name of this movement was in fact Idle No More. So this again relates to the importance of interjecting and turning on its head notions of racializing and racialized time. So that was sort of my, let's say, theoretical or conceptual umbrella that I wanted to bring us into while we talk about this. But what are we going to do about it? If we understand our position as one that's implicated in colonialism, implicated in racialized time, how can we work against this? How can we develop adjacent practices? And firstly, I want to talk through some curatorial strategies that I have found very helpful in curating against this notion of racialized time. So here is an image that I am actually really enthusiastic about. So it is from a 19th century collection of paintings and drawings from the Pahari Hills region in India, in the Punjab. And this is a scene of an imaginary city in India in the 19th century. And if you can see it, you'll see very front and center, there is a naked woman bathing. There are naked women kind of embedded in this picture in different places. There are, you might not be able to see it, but there are sea monsters. Here is a sea monster. Here's a turtle, I think. There are monkeys in the trees. And this was definitely made for export, we think. So this was a kind of painting that would have been sold in Europe to play into, let's say, certain kinds of fantasies about what the city in India or the city in Asia might look like. And when you're curating objects like this, I think one thing that the Ethnographic Museum has been very good at doing is looking at these things from art historical perspective. So I can tell you about the medium, I can tell you about the form, I can tell you about the atelier, where it may have come from. I can even tell you about that history of made for export prints, which of course is interesting and a huge part of the colonial imagination and the development of Orientalism. But unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I'm going to go to my next slide, when the hate crimes happened in Georgia last week, the first thing I thought about was how I was going to angle this image, because I had chosen this image with Paula much earlier for my talk, and I thought this was a way to talk about deep Orientalism. But one thing that has been increasingly frustrating, I've noticed for a lot of people, and there has been a lot of outcry about this, is the fact that people have made a distinction between the motivation around sort of sexualized crimes and racialized crimes in the United States, particularly against Asian women. And as a curator, I think objects like this are incredibly important to help us understand why we get responses like this. Why is it that we do not understand these kinds of intersections between racializations and sexualizations? And the museum itself, the Ethnographic Museum collection, is implicated in perpetuating, especially in the 19th century, many fantasies about the available woman from the colonies or from other places, from South Asia, for example, in this print. So what I would do in my curatorial practice is use objects like these to tell stories, but deeper histories, right? We have to see the critical lens within the objects that we're working with, beyond their art historical significance, so beyond this kind of detached aesthetic, to be able to understand better or to think through where inequities still exist in our world and use them to help intervene into tragedies. And I mean this in the most humble way, because I think this is really important also to sort of to sort of flag, is that when institutions often get involved in discussions around anti-racism, anti-fascism, or decolonial movements, they tend to co-opt them and appropriate them so much so that they lose all of their meaning. So part of the process of being implicated or understanding your implicatedness is understanding your limits within the institution. So I mean in the most humble way in terms of interjecting in tragedies like what happened in Georgia, is that it's at its basic an educational moment and a way to think through and educate for anti-racist features. That's very important. Another example I have relates to an exhibition that I opened in Rotterdam, along with quite a few other curators from my team when we were redoing the permanent exhibition of the World Museum. And I worked with an artist named Sarojini Lewis. And we sort of intervened into the historical photography of Indian indentured laborers who had come to Suriname. Now, what I think is very interesting is that we don't have a lot of material culture from Indo-Caribbean cultural practices, but what we do have is a very rich photographic archive in the Tropen Museum. And if you look at those images, you see that Indian bodies are immediately associated with the plantations on which they were meant to work, right? So very quickly, if this is coming completely out of left field, after the abolition of transatlantic enslavement, they needed people to come and work in the fields. So what they did is set up a system of contract labor, and the British colonies did this, French colonies, and also the Dutch colonies. The Dutch actually bought their Indian labor from the British. So there is already a really interesting optic with that happening. So they brought British Indian labor, as they call it, into Suriname. So Indian bodies might be too late for civilizational logic, but when you look through these pictures, you see that they arrived just in time to do the work of the formerly enslaved. So in many of the pictures, just like the one that we're looking at now, you see that the body is almost one with the landscape, right? In terms of how bodies are positioned, in terms of coloring, in terms of size. You can't really make out the body from the landscape. Here's a picture that I think is particularly jarring in that way. With this woman posing, a lot of the times people can't see where the leaves end and her veil starts, right? So bodies are part of the landscapes and bodies are work. So when you put this kind of object on display, what story is it telling, right? And to me, the story that's being perpetuated constantly when we work with this archive is that bodies are part of the landscape. If you look at these photos, you think, okay, Indians came to work. There is a natural relationship between the Indian body and work, right? And we wanted to interrupt this. So Sarojini Lewis and I decided to work with an installation that she had worked on earlier that's called Karela prayer. Karela being, if you can see, this very nobly green vegetable that's also in Suriname known as sopropo and in English known as bitter gourd. And it's a vegetable that would have been taken from India to the Caribbean and then grown in the Caribbean. And it's a vegetable that grows almost everywhere in the world. It's extremely resilient. So you can just bring seeds with it and you can grow it anywhere. And Sarojini uses that as a metaphor not only for migration, but also for the bittersweet memories and inheritances of the histories of forced labor and contract labor. So what she does is intervene into the linear history of Indians as laborers. And she does that by creating a film sequence, but she also did something that was particularly poignant, which was on the plantation paper pots. She did what she calls a cleansing ritual together with the Afro-Surinamese artist Danya Lemmer, who is pictured here, as a space of reconciliation and healing. So it was about acknowledging the pain of the plantation. So instead of going from this very natural, right, relationship with the land and tilling the land, Sarojini intervenes to heal and acknowledge that representations of bodies and plantations associated with the labor on plantations have been harmful and have been violent, right? So this was something that was really important to me in sort of working against racialized time, was to be able to speak and work with contemporary artists who have certain creative practices that can interrupt and respond to archives and to representations in our archives. And that's going to be something that I return that I come back to as we go later into some examples, is the idea of representations, right? And who has motivated these representations in the past, and how have they been mobilized, and what kind of work have they done? Because that is incredibly important to take stock of. So alongside the actual curatorial work, so how you're arranging objects or how you're dealing with objects, the work of collecting is hugely important in the museum, and then, you know, is what I am busy with. And in basically since June 2020, there has been the idea to develop a global anti-racism collection at the museum. And this was the initiative of my wonderful colleague and ally, Wendelina Flores, who is the curator of colonial histories and Caribbean cultures. And we came together and said, what kinds of interventions could you actually make in a museum to do anti-racist work? And we thought collecting anti-racist material would be a good step. So what does that actually mean? And I want to actually return to this also in a discussion, because the idea of collecting or not collecting certain things has come up, and we're having these discussions ongoing in the museum. So I want to take the example of a poster that is used during an actual protest. What happens if we were to collect that poster and then put it into the collection and entrench it into a museum's logic of racialized time? I think that there is sort of a dual question that's going on. Can you create an archive of immediacy, or should we think through the relationship between archives and immediacy? Personally, the way I'm seeing it now, I really think we need to do the latter, that we need to think through the relationship between archives and immediacy, because the idea of archives of immediacy, they seem to contradict each other. Again, it's the clashing of two very different realities related to time. So I think both Wendelina and I were a little bit uncomfortable with thinking, okay, so anti-racist collection means we go and grab a bunch of posters and we put them in our archive, and they sit alongside all of the rest of our stuff. So then, if not posters, then what is it that one could collect or should collect? And we are still kind of thinking through this together. So one item that I think is really interesting, and that Wayne Modis, who is the content director of National Museum of World Cultures, and also Wendelina Flores had brought to my attention, is this piece by Emily Paris called Thug. And what I think is so interesting with this object is its sustained kind of multi-layered critique of a certain moment in history, right? So the textile here as handicraft often in the Ethnographic Museum comes up. So when the Ethnographic Museum collected, you know, clothing, it would often be called textile or kind of the work of a maker, right? And you would ignore the stories of who actually made it or what actually went into making it. So it'd be collected as an aesthetic object mostly. But here you can do this interpretation. You can break down this kind of object and see different kinds of stories that it tells. So Emily Paris's piece is really a response to wearing a hoodie, right, as an African American in the United States, and making use of different kinds of patterns that relate to the Underground Railroad, if I remember correctly. So this is really kind of an interesting piece that you could break down, and I think would stand in a collection, and you could look through this and look back through the archive and understand where it's coming from and how it intervenes, especially into some of the textiles that we have collected in the past, right? So for me, it's also about an object that can tell multiple stories. Another aspect, I think, of collecting anti-racism uh, that is what I would call joyfully disruptive, um, is playing with the very ideas or the very representations that we have collected in the past and turning them again on its head. And in a way that mobilizes humor and satire. So obviously, Sarojini Lewis is doing the work of turning things on its head, but through a lens of kind of care and reconciliation. But there's also been some very sharp satire that I've come across that I think would be really interesting. And I want to bring in um, this example here, what I would call the joyful disruptions of the Indian and the Indian context, which of course I grew up with in North America. And these are kind of a spattering of um, popular culture images of Indians and indigenous peoples, right? And we know in the North American context, until very recently, using the term Indian and Indian to describe both. Um, and we see, of course, the use of feathers and headdresses, turbans, this kind of what I would call obedience, right? There's a kind of benignness to this as well. Here we have the Cleveland Indians mascot, and it is still the mascot, and I don't even know how, but it is. And you see that kind of friendly, goofy smile, right? You see this kind of nobility, right? This idea, the stereotype of the noble savage. You see the completely ridiculous, right, stereotype of the Indian here. And something that is very interesting that we will return back to is this encounter, which for me was really ubiquitous when I was growing up, which is the encounter between the pilgrim and the Indian and that friendly kind of interaction at first contact, right? So we see this in our collection. And I'm going to cycle back to this picture again. So this is the studio portrait of Maharaja Sadar from Jodhpur. And so this kind of idea of the adorned Maharaja in his splendor and also in his turban, of course, and his headgear, something you see in our collection as well. And there are a couple of artists who are intervening into both notions of, let's say, Indianness in a really interesting and, let's say, disruptive way that I want to bring up. And one of them is Jacob Meters. And this is from his window dressing, Indians Behind Glass 2017 exhibition. Now, Jacob's work, he is a master printmaker himself, based out of Phoenix, but he's also really interested in collecting popular culture representations of indigenous peoples, especially in the US. And you see in this exhibition, he's found these pieces, right? So here you have the over sexualized, sexy indigenous woman with her long hair, right? The headdress, the cowboys and Indians, and the Walt Disney kind of version of Indians. And his work is very much, you know, found objects or creations or of representations, or sorry, recreations of racist representations. And he intervenes into these representations in these kind of popular culture and museum contexts. Another artist who works with another notion of Indianness is Chirag Bhakta, who works under the name Pardon My Hindi. And he had an exhibition called White People Doing Yoga. He had an installation called White People Doing Yoga, which intervened into the intersection between capitalism and yoga as it is practiced today. And he himself is also very engaged in institutional critique, right? So he actually had a very interesting and, let's say, negative experience of being institutionally policed when he put White People Doing Yoga together after it was commissioned by the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, where people found, you know, people in the museum found that, you know, the use of the word white was going to alienate a certain kind of audience, and that people wanted control over what the merchandising was going to look like. And he felt very much like, as the only South Asian that had been consulted for the whole exhibition, that he was being treated in a very specific kind of way. And he actually has built has built exhibition practice and interventive practice based on his experience trying to do this exhibition as well. And a piece that I think is incredibly interesting, rich, satirical for an anti-racist collection is this print that Chirag has made, which really disrupts representation. And this is really where I was going with the Indian and the Indian thing. So he has this here where he reimagines and imagines solidarities across representations. And to me, what I think is so powerful about this piece is that it reimagines the handshake. See here, that we saw here. So it's a reimagining of that handshake as solidarities in terms of, fighting anti-racist kind of representation. So this kind of piece, I think, also would be very interesting to intervene into a collection that has quite a lot of pictures like this, right? So if we talk about curating and collecting, we have talked about the bread and butter of the museum, right? Of what I do at the museum, sorry. But we are talking about equitable futures and fashioning them. So if we accept, let's say, that ethnographic museums need to rethink their relationship to time, what are we doing beyond collecting and curating? And this is where I think the notion of hospitable versus safe spaces comes into debate, and is something that we need to think through. I have here a set of images from Mwazula Diabanza, who in the summer of 2020 came into the Africa Museum in Bergendal and removed a grave statue as part of his activism, which is very much about decolonizing the museum, but also is against this idea of looted or stolen objects, particularly from the African continent. And as a member of African diaspora, he believes that the material culture that exists in European museums belongs to him, right? And belongs to a different set of people. Now, what I think is so interesting about this, and I think it goes far beyond whether this is a legal issue, whether this is right or wrong, whether this is, black or white, it's about the ways in which sort of realities are being fashioned about objects. And I think it's incredibly important for us to understand in the museum how people are going to relate to objects in different ways. And that's why I have this sort of idea of provenances of affect and provenances of representation written down here. Because I think at the end of the day, if we don't pay attention to the kind of effective responses that objects have on people, we do not do justice to the idea of making the museum a hospitable space. I think that the idea of the museum being a safe space, it may be too much of an ideal. There may be so much embedded and implicated in our colonial past that it can never be safe for certain people. But that doesn't mean that it cannot be hospitable and welcoming, and that we can't be a space where we enter into dialogue, where we enter into conversation, carrying conversation with people. So traditionally, provenance, and this sounds like a very fancy word, but really what it means is kind of tracing back the origin of an object, sort of an art historical lineage would really say, this is the object when it enters into the collection, and this is how we can sort of trace it back to when it was made, let's say, or when it was acquired. And then that sort of considered the provenance. And I think that is incredibly important work to do, especially now in the moment that we're at, where we are dealing with, quote unquote, colonial collections. Knowing where your objects come from is incredibly important. But that's one kind of history. We need to understand that objects carry with them very different kinds of provenances. So an anti-racist provenance could be a representational provenance. So how has this object been mobilized in the past to reinstate racist stereotypes? And what kinds of representation has it been entangled in? This would give us a sense of accountability in our implicatedness. So that's when I cycle back to this object, right, to this picture. It's a, how has this been mobilized in the past? Because in and of itself, it's a portrait of a Maharaja. And it might be implied in this that there are certain notions of power in the way that the Maharaja is adorned, through his gaze, right, through the way that they're positioned in the studio. There will always be that kind of context. But in and of itself, we don't necessarily know much about how it's been mobilized as a representation, but it can do violent work if it's been put into a context that is to be made ridiculous, that is to be made, that makes it exotic, for example, or of course relegates it to a certain point in time. If all of our our discussions around India are 1900 Maharaja discussions, right? We are playing into that racialized kind of notion of time. So that's why the representational provenances, I think, are very important. But then on the other hand, there is the affective provenance. And this cycles back to, I think, Muad'Dib Diabanta's activism and certain kinds of calls that are coming from outside the museum. And that is to understand what kinds of emotional entanglements does an object have? What kind of emotional responses does it trigger and elicit from different kinds of audiences? And this is a practice of care, I would say, in our adjacency that's incredibly important. If you want to stand adjacent to the critics who are forcing you to think through things so that you may be better, if you want to position yourself towards a more equitable future in general, you need to be doing this kind of care. And so with this example, some people might raise, the idea and say, well, he just went in and took an object that actually wasn't stolen and doesn't come from the context that he's thinking of. And actually, we have all of the documentation to say where it comes from, right? We have that art historical provenance, and it doesn't map onto what he's saying. Well, that's because this object actually exists in a completely different affective register for him than we are interpreting, that it has an affective life beyond its art historical or kind of, let's say, aesthetic, material culture provenance. And when we start taking those kind of affective provenances seriously, I think we will be able to have conversations around this kind of activism in a way that's more productive, right? And that's the kind of thing that I would be interested in moving towards. And I think there are a lot of people within the museum as well. And I have to say, I'm very lucky in that these kinds of conversations are they're on the table at the institution where I work, which is incredibly encouraging, of course. So that's sort of the last, and I think probably the most challenging work that we have to do is getting the space, turning our space into one of hospitable care in our adjacency and in our implicatedness. So sort of by way of conclusion, let's cycle back to time. Let's cycle back to Gil Scott-Heron, right? I think one of the reasons why I was so moved to sort of develop my title based on his work is because that last line in his song, where the revolution will be no rerun, brothers, the revolution will be live. I think to me, that's all about this immediacy. This is all about time, right? And it just hits home to me the ways in which social movements are thinking about their moments so differently than the way we're trying to archive, the way we're constantly trying to describe, over-describe perhaps, our objects and our histories in a specific way without paying attention to what's happening around us. And I think once we develop and once we think through time in different ways and from different perspectives, and certainly racialized time is one perspective, right? There might be different angles in which we can go into this. But once we start thinking about time differently, we might be able to indeed respond and position ourselves differently in the future too. I think I'm going to wrap it up there, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very insightful. if I'm very honest, I've been fangirling all the way.
Oh, that is really good to know, because
Yeah, also like it's yeah, anyway, I'll ask my own questions later, but shall we open up for Q&A for everyone? So a few things. Turn on your camera if you want to ask any questions yourself. Otherwise, I will also address the questions if you put them in the chat box. But we do prefer face-to-face interaction. Yeah.
well, I mean, there's lots to digest also. I mean, you know, and that there is also the provocation of that I'm really interested in is for those of you who are makers, right? Makers and designers. So how does that map on to what you are doing, right? So I mean, in terms of if you are making work that's going to maybe be displayed or become part of the exhibition space in an ethnographic museum, how do you think through that? So I've spoken a lot about time, but you know, there's also this issue of space that maybe as designers you think through in a way that's completely different than the way I think through it.
Yeah.
So that could be.
Well, I'm gonna throw you under the bus, but shoot, if you have any questions.
No, I'm still thinking. I may have in a second. I think my first question was related to the last slide, so kind of already been answered. Yeah, but I have a lot to think. So thank you. I mean, now that you gave me the word, thank you so much. So interesting. So I take the occasion to acknowledge the very interesting topic. But...
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I think with everything that is going on, I'm not sure if I should be mentioning this right now with the schools happening and the situation in the Dutch art institutions and the accusations, I would say, and the incident. I think this is not a question, but a comment of yeah, what is the role of the institution into this and in the whole picture, and how it seems that they don't fit together, activism and institutions that are just slow. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically it, and I mentioned it, but you know, I just want to come back to it. It's institutions have to position themselves, understand their position, and also understand this from, I think, a humble place. There's only so much you can do. It's also an ethical question. It's like, as an institution, what can you do and what should you do? So, you know, I am of the opinion that activism is best left up to the activists, right? And what I'm prepared to do and what I'm happy to do and what I'm enthusiastic to do and passionate is to stand adjacent to that, right? And so in my capacity within the institution, I can work on collecting, I can work on curating, I can work on these kinds of things. And that's what you do. And you also respond to that. Your institution responds to activism in a way that makes sense for that institution. That doesn't mean that, you know, we get off easy and that you don't change. No, you absolutely have to change. But let's say we decided there was going to be a day out and the Tropen Museum we were all in June 2020, we were all going to drop our work and go and protest for the day for Black Lives Matter. And then we come back to the museum and then everything proceeds the same way. That is not doing anything, right? So you have to work within what you have, and you have to be humble about what you can do, right? So the museum isn't the space where everything is going to be turned upside down in the same way that when you have thousands of people marching on the Dam, things are going to turn upside down, right? Yeah. But for that kind of immediacy to be sustained or sort of find itself reverberating, you have to also respond with an institution.
Yeah.
So that's something else, you know, because a lot of the time also you have within institutions, people are like, oh, we're going to decolonize. We're going to, even within the university, how are we going to decolonize academic research? It's like, well, you can't really, actually. The biggest joke I had with some of my friends is after I gave you the title of my talk, I said, it's going to be the world's shortest talk because I'm just going to say no. And then I'm going to leave because that's exactly what Gil Scott-Heron is saying. It's not going to be institutionalized because it's happening now. But other things, the institution can do other things and be revolutionary in different ways, in adjacent ways. So that's what we need to do, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Please, anyone.
Question. If people don't want to ask questions. Oh, wait, no, Jewel has a question. Sorry. No, sorry.
I don't know if it's a good question, but I'm very triggered by what you're saying about immediacy, and I find it really interesting when you compare it to, when you bring that with your practice of being a curator, and so what you mentioned about archiving, and I'm wondering how those articulate, because if I understand it correctly, this immediacy, it's also like a feeling, right, and something that is activated, and how is there a way that this kind of let's say thinking of like inheritance, or thinking of this practice of archiving, they can meet with this immediacy?
So I think that is a really interesting and important question, and I think it's a larger issue, and that's when at the end of the day, that's what I struggle with. How to reconcile, or can you reconcile, immediacy and the archive? And then how do you archive immediacy? Should you even archive it? To me, it's actually an ethical question. Is that what happens if we, for example, we collect 20 Black Lives Matter posters from people who protested? Let's say we went to the protest and we collected them all. We had them in our hands and said, okay, we're going to put them in the collection, but we're going to subject them to the kinds of description, archiving that we do to every other object. And those things, to me, have, as you said, some kind of power of immediacy, some kind of emotion, some kind of feeling that I think just completely undermines the archive, that we would be doing, I think, an ethical disservice to those objects by putting them into the Ethnographic Museum in such a specific way. And honestly, there are loads of people who think differently about this. So they have a lot of institutions do what they call rapid response collecting. I think they do it at the African American Museum in the Smithsonian. But this is a really interesting example. I think it makes complete sense for the African American Museum to collect Black Lives Matter posters. I think because of the way the institution is positioned, and the very fact that it is trying, as a Museum of African American, it is intervening into that racialized time that Fanon is talking about, where Black bodies are, Black bodies and cultures are relegated to a certain civilizational position. So the institutional logic of that space is very different than the one I'm working in, right? And I know the Victoria and Albert Museum also does rapid response collecting, but they position themselves differently too. They're a museum, in fact, about design, right? So again, that's interesting, but I don't necessarily know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
We have a question in the chat box. What can be done to counter the time imposed on by funding structures? As an architect/city planner, this notion of time makes me think of how colonial time ties into funding sources that are often tied to bank loans, etc. And these bank-focused time effectively do not allow the time/space to involve communities that do not and cannot.
That is a really, really brilliant question. So thank you to who asked it. And it's something that it's a huge part of how our museum is trying to think through how to work in the future. And it is a question, it's a question of this kind of the capitalism, right? The intersection of the colonial, colonial and the capitalism, the late capitalism that we exist in today, and that notion of time, which I think is really interesting. Because museums operate in the same sort of way, is that there's never enough money and there's never enough time to do the care that needs to be done, because that the care is something that is so sustained and requires us to slow down in many, many ways. Whereas the moment that we're in requires us to speed up, and funding requires us, right, to also speed up. So I have to start by saying I don't have the answer to this question. What I can do is acknowledge, first of all, that this is a really, really important issue, and second of all, that this is something that I think we have to put pressure on institutions to understand better. And I feel very lucky because there are a lot of people within my institution who feel that this is an important ethical commitment as well. And that's the investment in people and the investment in voices, people, bodies who have not felt comfortable in the museum before. The ones who are alienated by the space need to be heard, right, in a specific way, or these kinds of stories need to be part of the work that we do. And that requires us to rethink, to be honest, what we value out of the work that we do. So what is the end product of what we're going to make? Is it going to be an exhibition that thousands of people go to? Or is it something that we've done in an ethical, collaborative way that changes or that alters or remedies some kind of practice that we have misstepped with in the past, right? And I think having a strong sense of what the ethics of the institution needs to be in order to move towards an ethical future is the only way that you can deal with this kind of intersection of the late capitalism and the time and the exclusion, right? The constant exclusion of certain bodies and certain voices.
Ramon?
I might have a question, related to the one that has been said. No, just if you have any example of, I don't know, limitation like throughout your career, because you work for an institution. So maybe for conflict of interest, like have you been limited by, I don't know, banks, political sake or anything?
Oh, there are lots of limitations that I have. Yeah, I mean, I think you have them a lot of the time. I mean, the work that one does in the museum, you don't do it alone. So there are a lot of stakeholders who are involved, and you have to understand in an institution, right? There are different elements that need to come together to be able to produce exhibitions, to care for collections, to do all of this kind of thing. So you're never just kind of a standalone body. There are always issues around, you know, at the end of the day, I'm implicated in this institution because the institution pays me, right? I get a salary out of this. So I am beholden to the institution just like anyone else who's working in an institution. And I think there are always compromises. I think it was, you know, working, for example, actually there were limitations and then there were ways to work around them. A good example would be, you know, Sarojini Lewis's work that I brought up here. It was not the most accessible piece of work in the beginning, right? So a lot of people thought it was an exhibition, like within my institution, thought it was an exhibition about a vegetable. So everyone's mind kind of started racing. They're like, and we're going to serve this food. We'll serve the vegetable at the opening, and then we'll make cocktails out of the juice of the vegetable, and then we'll put pictures of the vegetable everywhere. And we really had to, you know, and there were moments where I would get really frustrated about it and nervous and say, we are going to not do justice to someone's artwork if we keep on this way. And what it really took were sustained conversations. And it's interesting that we've been talking about time and we're talking about exhaustion. Yeah, sometimes conversations, having them over and over again can be exhausting and you feel like they're limiting, but if you do it enough and you sit down and you need to have a sustained line of why something's important and have, really grounded in why this is part of the ethics of the museum, and then you can move forward. What I have to say about working at the museum that I work at, we are a national institution, so we get funding from the government. So that means whatever it means, but it means that also we're unlike something like the British Museum that gets external money in. Or you see this a lot in American institutions, for example, at the Whitney or other galleries where there's been a lot of activism around where their money comes from, right? And what kinds of people sit on their boards and how they are implied, like that big money that comes in. And we actually don't have that kind of financial problem, so to speak, because we don't have that many external donors. But then at the end of the day, we also, it is a government institution, so you are bound to those perils.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I also had, I was wondering about this, about the tropes and these artworks that you have that are showing these different stereotypes. How do you deal with, and I'm sure it has to do a lot with the conversation that you have with each artist, but I'm just wondering if you have some insights in this, because it's sometimes that it's something that it's easy to struggle with, and it's how do you make sure you are recontextualizing the trope instead of just reproducing it?
So that is also a really important point and very interesting point that you raised. And this is something we have all the time in the Ethnographic Museum, especially with our photography collection. When we say, okay, we want to be critical of our past, we want to be critical of colonial encounter, and then we go to our archives of colonial photography, we get them out, and then we think about putting them on display. And then we're like, wait a minute, if we put all of this on display right now, aren't we just reinstating all of the stereotypes we're trying to smash, right? So we are constantly having a conversation about if and should. That's a huge part of our, let's say, everyday experience. And it's incredibly difficult to be able to predict also how this kind of material across different audiences will be interpreted. So I actually am of the mind that we should stop trying to predict audience responses and create spaces and moments where people can reflect on objects and ideas and themes and give people the mental space to be able to do that, rather than trying to say, okay, this is going to make everyone feel really good, so we're going to put that there. This is the depressing stuff, so we'll put it at the end. And I'm not saying that's how people work, but boiled down, that kind of attitude, because you really can't. And so something like Chirag's work, right, the Das Racist print, is so very blatantly calling out racism because it says Das Racist across it. And then because I find such care in the way that piece is put together. In that, so the Indian figure, so South Asian Indian, is actually based on the Air India mascot. So someone from the Indian subcontinent would probably recognize the Air India mascot right away. So it's playing with like a really well-entrenched historical stereotype there. And the same thing with the kind of idea of the chief wearing the headdress. But because the handshake is there, I think that is so important as a reimagining. The reimagining of the wampum belt design also, which is something that's really important in indigenous art. Like, I think that there was care put into that, and it was always from the outset very clear what he was trying to do. So that's why I would think that is a great piece to put in. The same thing with Emily Karas's hoodie, where it is, not only a comment on Black Lives Matter, male bodies, hoodies, what's happening in the United States, as well as the textile patterns, African textile patterns that relate to moments of freedom, empowerment, and the Underground Railroad. It's like those kinds of things do certain types of work and do tell certain kinds of stories. This is why I think that's the way to go for collecting, as opposed to, yeah, what would be actually collecting racism, right? Because that's another way you could go. It'd be like the way that Jacob does it is he collects all the representations, but then as an artist, he mobilizes them in different ways, right? He intervenes. And to me, that's the privilege of the artist. It's not the privilege of the curator in the Ethnographic Museum. If we tried to do what Jacob did, it would be racist, right? So you have to also, again, that's about understanding your positionality, I think. Sorry, I think I took that in a crazy direction.
No, I like it. So great response, thanks.
I wanted to comment something that I was thinking, and I think you mentioned just now, and you mentioned in the lecture as well, that either museum or things, but the term of safe space that we've been questioning a lot as well within our department. That is actually not a safe space, but a brave space. That there's no space that is gonna, there's no space that's gonna be safe for everyone. But just to be brave enough to be saying them, And I thought that was that the first time that I heard about it, it was very shocking, but also like very wow.
When you heard about the brave space.
Brave space.
Yeah, no, that sounds wonderfully empowering, actually, and interesting. And that's sort of, I think that's what we sort of want to do also with our museum, is have people indeed feel, in a sense, brave enough to come in. But certainly from our perspective, we need to be hospitable, right? So we need to be inviting to people. And I think in the past, ethnographic museums have not been inviting enough, right? And so I think now when certain kinds of museums are trying to say, oh, we're going to make everything safe, don't worry, we'll make everything safe. You can't do that now. But I think brave space might have a place in our museum. I'm really excited to tell my colleagues about it. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, we read a piece. I don't remember.
I think someone just put it in the chat, right? From safe space to brave space.
Oh yes, thank you, Jill.
Very cool.
Yeah, that was a really nice reading session that we had before. Okay, so there's another question from Liti. Thank you for the insightful. Thank you for the insightful lecture. There's a lot to process, but if I understood correctly, you suggested collecting anti-racial material like the Black Lives Matter poster as a way of breaking the linearity of racialized times. As intriguing as it is, wouldn't it also be providing a platform that instigates more racism? If not, how do you think it can be dealt with without bringing back memories of pain and terror?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, because that is also a really interesting, important point to remember. I just want to say, actually, I don't necessarily think I would collect Black Lives Matter posters for the anti-racism collection. Just for what I was saying before, is that the idea that those posters have a certain kind of life and immediacy that I think wouldn't be well suited to the way that we archive. But in the idea of inviting more racism, right? Or let's say would you mean sort of inviting a racist response to the fact that we're collecting anti-racism? Or is it more a sense of, in putting anti-racist objects into the collection, there is a certain amount of, well, let's say no, first of all, maybe I do need a clarification about whether it is an issue of would there be a response to having an anti-racist collection? Is that what the question is about? Could you maybe reread it to me, Paula? Sorry.
As intriguing as it is, wouldn't it, the fact of collecting the Black Lives Matter poster, providing a platform that instigates more racism? If not, how do you think it can be dealt with without bringing back memories of pain or terror?
Well,
Liti's here.
Yay, perfect. Hi, Liti. Sorry, can you elaborate just a little bit, because your question is super interesting, but I don't know if I've interpreted it properly.
Yeah, no, I think it's more of will the space sort of like there'll obviously be dialogue about whatever is being presented, but would that sort of like, I mean, I'm just wondering if the space would then provide, like, become a place, or the dialogue between people would become a place for just more racism if such things are displayed. I don't know if you got that.
Is it
No, I
like
get that.
reproducing it?
But
Yes, no, sort of like, I think whenever we make something public, we are, first and foremost, we are we are making a space for dialogue. And I'm just wondering if through the dialogue, we are sort of like, propagating more racism by putting up such material. So.
yeah, I think I understand exactly what you're saying now, and it is really interesting. And it's actually, for a museum, so a museum is a public intellectual space, right? So in theory, everyone is welcome in the museum. So that means the fascists and the racists are as welcome as the anti-fascists and the anti-racists, because it's a public space, so anyone can enter it. But in making certain kinds of commitments about fashioning yourself in a certain kind of future, I think the museum opens itself up to be able to do certain things. So in 2017, the Tropa Museum opened an exhibition called The Afterlives of Slavery. And that was really precedent setting, because it was not just an exhibition. It wasn't an exhibition on the history of transatlantic enslavement. It was about how the afterlives of that system reverberate in contemporary Dutch society today. So in that exhibition, there was a section that was about Zwarte Piet, for example, and objects including a protest sign, but other things. Very interestingly, an actor who had for years played Zwarte Piet donated his shoes to the Tropa Museum because he decided to stop playing that role after a certain period of time, after realizing the kind of context and the racism around Zwarte Piet. He gave that role up and donated his costume to the Tropa Museum. So those objects were in the exhibition. And that, I think, that was a moment in our history that I think has defined how we're going to go through and do things in the future. But I'm sure that exhibition probably turned a lot of people away from our museum, right? It also brought in a whole different audience. And that's what I think is so interesting about being, and here I'll use your terminology, brave enough, right, to do things for different kinds of audiences. Because I think no one sets out, so you're doing an exhibition like Afterlives of Slavery, no one set out to say, let's alienate the white mainstream audience, right? Let's alienate conservative white Dutch people. No, let's make an exhibition that maybe they're not, might not be traditionally how we have targeted that audience before, but let's make an exhibition that absolutely relates to Dutch history in a general way, and see what kind of audiences come in. So also understanding that there are different kinds of audiences that you might bring in for different reasons at different times. I saw that also with the exhibition we did on Mecca. One thing that was I found really moving and cool was that a lot of people who had never set foot in the museum were interested to come to the museum to see what we had done on Mecca, because it's a topic that pulls in a different kind of audience that maybe usually comes to the Tropa Museum. And to me, that's brilliant. Bring in as many different kinds of people as you can in a public institution, right? And I think some of our programming, maybe it does open us up for backlash, right? But then you have to, again, it's your positioning. Are you going to be so afraid of the backlash that you're not going to do anything? Or are you going to think through how to do this in a way that also, and this again is about being an institution, right? So that Elliot was asking about limitations. It's not necessarily a limitation, but it's a reality. Being a public institution, we are beholden to a very big audience. So we have to understand that our content needs to apply to that audience. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't do what we want to do, but we have to think about how to do it very carefully.
Yeah, I've also was not wondering, but I feel like sometimes the point is not being, also I feel like the word inclusivity has been used too much and used lightly as well. But actually the point is not being inclusive, but to not be excluded. That is actually the point. Also, like, yeah. A remark
Yeah.
on that.
No, I mean, I know, and these kinds of terms, right? And so now that the king and queen is what diversity and inclusion, right? So every institution thinking about diversity and inclusion. I'm sure it's in your program too. It's in every university program. But I think I've gone to a lot of these kind of discussions, and people see diversity as a problem, right? As a beleid issue, right? So I always say when it's my turn to sort of say something, I'm like, if you think diversity is an issue that needs to be solved and not something related to structural change, then we all need to go off and rethink what it is we're doing and come back together, right? When we have a certain kind of, let's say, sustained commitment. And I think that's something that's really important. So again, having to do with time. While activism is intensely immediate, institutions need to be sustained in their responses. So that's why we can't just mirror what's happening with activism. We can't just be like, okay, today we're going to join the protest. Today we're going to have a black square on our Instagram, and then we've done the work we need to do. It's like, no, you need to go off and do some serious structural change, and then come back, and then we can kind of all stand shoulder to shoulder and do work together.
Yeah.
I have a question now. Can I?
Yes, please.
No, I think it's kind of linked to what you just said. Because when we talk about archiving, we have this notion of kind of organizing or processing at least what we're archiving. So somehow, like, the notion of archiving time, it's getting really like sort of in a clashing way, because the documentation start to overlap with archiving somehow. So putting something that is happening now, so like the revolution will be televised, basically it's like kind of documenting without processing, which I think I don't know, like it's not really a question, it's more a reflection, but I don't know if you how do you see the notion of time kind of interweaving with within the two, maybe, because sometimes it's actually important what is happening now, but reflected something different maybe in an institution or in a cultural institution.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I think is really well encompassed in the Emily Carris hoodie and in Chirag's print, is that to me responds to an immediacy, responds to a moment, but in a way that suits, or perhaps not suits, but kind of intervenes in an effective way into the into museum logic also. So when you pull that hoodie out in 20 years, you will be able to unpack those stories and unpack those moments in a way I don't necessarily think you would be able to do in our museum if you pulled out a bunch of protest posters. To be like, oh yeah, there was this moment, and here are the cardboard posters that people use, right? And I think it would lose all of its meaning. So looking for these objects that are really kind of multi-layered in a sense and suit the institution in that way is kind of a strategic way to deal with anti-racism, I think. So that's precisely why I pulled those two examples out, and I kind of refer to them quite a lot.
We still have time for one last question. Go for it.
Hey, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I also wanted to make a remark that also, and a question, I don't know, that kind of ties with also my experience of being here at the Design Academy, and is something that you said really struck a chord with me, and relating to that experience at the Design Academy and how it has a history of portraying itself as an institution that teaches and houses what we can call critical design, or a certain type of design that falls into a certain way of doing things, or being engaged in critique of itself, supposedly. And yeah, something that you said really struck a chord, because how can an institution really practice criticality without co-opting it, without it becoming basically PR, public relationship marketing? Because sometimes I feel that we can very quickly fall into appropriating like radical revolutionary movements, their vocabulary, their traditions, and using that to communicate a certain image, right? And it can fall into the instrumentalization of those efforts and of those who engage with them, causing more harm sometimes. And how do we as institutionally bound people, where do we draw the line between really engaging with these efforts or weaponizing them for gaining points for being critical? Do you understand what I'm coming from?
Oh, I understand 100%, and it's just super profoundly an issue that I think a lot of people are going through, and I think it's also something that you know, when I talk to people in institutions that are genuinely critical, so you know, people working at the Black Archives, and people have said to me, "Oh, I don't even use the word decolonial anymore because it's lost all of its meaning."
Yeah, exactly.
And it, you know, and I think in a sense, it's very much true. Is that, you know, we've got people in museums who are saying, "Oh, and we're going to make this decolonial exhibition, and we're going to decolonize here, and we'll do this decolonial thing." I think we have to be really, really careful with the language that we use, right? So, and think, is it decolonial? So this is what I always do. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Sara Ahmed, the philosopher, feminist killjoy. So I'm kind of like a bit of a killjoy in my meetings, because I'm often, people are like, decolonizing, doing this. I said, oh, but are we really doing this? Are we the ones who are going to decolonize? And you sort of need to get a little bit in your killjoy mode. You have to be super critical as an individual itself when you are in an institution. Again, and this also relates to, perhaps that's a really negative way to frame it. More, let's say productively, it's about being humble, right? So it's understanding what your limitations are and your implicatedness in the museum or in the institution itself, to be like, this is what I can do and this is what I will do, you know? And it's the should, could question. Could we do this? Yeah, we probably could. Should we do it? No, we can't. Could we say this? Yeah, we could say we're going to do a decolonial marketing PR thing. Should we do it? Probably not, right? And I think it's just, and I think this is what's happened throughout history. I think that is probably, you know, the moment that we're in right now is just a lead up of all of these kinds of things. So you have someone like Gil Scott-Heron who's talking about it in 1971. People are talking about it also in 2021, right? The appropriation of Black Lives Matter, the appropriation of decolonize this place by the very structures and peoples who, you know, perpetuate a lot of this violence, right? These are the afterlives, right, of colonialism that we need to pay attention to. And I think a lot of the time also is, if you have different kinds of people working within institutions, then thinking can change. So, I mean, that's why I do think it is important for a lot of us to stay in certain institutions so that thinking can change. I don't think it's a sense of, no, we all just need to abandon them. You know, they all need to burn to the ground. No, structural change can happen. It takes a lot of effort and time, and it can be emotionally exhausting. But we all, you know, we need to try to navigate those kinds of spaces. So it's great that you guys are all now at the Design Academy and thinking about these kinds of things, right? And breaking it open and saying, no, it's not safe space, it's brave space, right? No, this isn't this critical utopia that everyone has said that has been in the history, right? Like, making people reckon with their history is a really important way to begin this kind of work.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One last burning question. cool. So I actually do have I prepare a few questions, but I think you've already answered along the way. But I'm gonna just bring it up anyway. Please bear with me. So this is really more of the lecture committee's position in the school. So I've also, especially in the beginning of the school year, planning this program.
Mm-hmm.
And we were thinking we are part of the student body, of course, but we're also very much financially dependent on the school. And I do feel like sometimes in this hybrid position that we are having, and personally, I want to do more than just bridging the two. And you've mentioned it already, but yeah, practicalities perhaps, depending. There's a Taiwanese saying that it's about cheating, but I thought it was very suitable here, that it's one foot on one boat, another foot on another boat. I was like, this is us, like we're on the student body and we are in the school as well, if I'm saying the school is an institution. And how can we push it and do more than just bridging the two? That I feel like that's what we've been doing, but also how to go beyond than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think already bridging the two is a huge achievement. So you should really take that as a win. First of all, no, it is honestly, because it can be exhausting work to come in and be like, not only am I going to be a student and beholden to the fact that I need to develop my practice, right? So that the everyday of being in the school, and then being like, I'm going to do a lecture series, a critical lecture series, an intervention into the institution's history, right? That is already something that's really intensely time consuming and emotionally consuming. I think it's actually a really apt saying what you just put in there, that you've got, feet on different boats. Really, you've got limbs on different boats, perhaps. I think it's important to engage with a wide kind of public also. So one thing I think that keeps me really down to earth and accountable is talking to people who actually come into the museum, right? And also talking to people who hate the museum is really, it's actually really productive. People who say it's boring and it's racist and I hate it and everything's stolen. And even if that is not true, I think it's good to be able to have those conversations so you understand. So, people who are doing critical work in different kinds of institutions are really important. What I always say also, and it seems really obvious, in sort of my line of work and the people who there are lots of people doing amazing things, but we're not that well connected actually. We all kind of see each other on social media and we'll give each other shout outs and props and we'll go to each other's openings and stuff like that. But we don't sit down together, in the before times when you could, where you sit down together and just talk it out. And sometimes when that has happened, it is the most healing and exciting moment to be in. So what I would suggest is, where are the other institutions like DAE that are dealing with these kinds of things, even if it's a different university group? There's Leiden University had the safe space to talk about race, the STAR program. People who are running that are super stellar, really interesting academics, but also activists. And what would it mean to map onto what they're doing? It's honestly about connecting. And what I think is great is that the Netherlands is so small. We can all get into one space if we wanted to, if we could, and talk about these kinds of things. So we should really I would think about linking up more sustained with other groups who are thinking through this, and get a sense of what are their struggles, what are our struggles, what do we share? Because I think one thing with this work that we should all acknowledge, and I hope that you all who are engaged in it know and are aware of, is how much of an emotional toll it can take on you.
Yeah.
And given that you're all in a really competitive program as well, it might creep up on you without knowing. And so I would say having a support system, having people who just have your back and understand the way you're thinking or visioning the world is not only encouraging, but it's empowering, and it's also the way in which sustained change can happen. Because if you see that they're doing something different in Leiden University that's working, you can implement it at DAE, right? And the other way around. So I would say connect.
That's going to be the agenda next year for us.
Connect, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's insight. Yeah, I've never
do
really thought
do
about
a
it.
conference or something like that, where you do basically this platform, but it's students like you who are doing this work, and
Yeah.
get an agenda set, right? And also, some of my friends, especially the ones who aren't working in academia and curatorial work, where we really do have the privilege of thinking a lot, right?
Hmm.
You need to do also, right? So get a list of action points of what are the things you need to get done, right? And what are the changes that can actually be made, and then work towards that, because that also feels really good when you feel like, yeah, we're thinking about this, we're thinking about practice, we're thinking about this, but we're also doing. We also have this list of the practical things we can do.
Yeah, yeah, very true. Um, Last burning question, if anyone has it. Otherwise, we're gonna
Yes.
close up. Okay.
I have just a very small question, because I'm so sorry, but I am working also about how you are speaking about this kind of discussion, critical actions about connect, but I work also about the how we can archive and how we can get record all these kind of discussions that we create in safe spaces of like institution, schools, or also new spaces, like also in museums. They are working with social activities since the last 20 years at least, in curatorial activities, almost from the document or whatever. They create these new safe spaces to discuss and to have critics. But after that, to have this memoria of this kind of discussions, it's so hard to arrive until these lights of democratic actions, at least also just we can find in some works of art that they connect, but at least it's just an essential. It's not all the corpus that we discuss in these safe spaces, that, and also the ways to have this kind of record or this kind of archive. I think it's the newest step also for the historians, because it's something that it started in the last 20 years, and also to change the institution, but at least it's something that change. It's very hard also with the marketing of the new markets and web and new medias. At least we don't have this kind of archive that it's collect all of the over the process or in discussion. So.
No, I know what you mean. It's actually, indeed, again, it's that issue around the immediacy and then what happens in the moment, right, when these discussions are happening. But how do you hold on to it in a sense that you can build upon it, right? So,
yes,
without being too, let's say, idealistic about the immediacy, right? You do want that the immediacy should have some kind of follow through for it to be able to build upon it. I mean, that's actually a really good question that I imagine is best answered by those who are involved in those discussions, right? So it's about how do we capture what we're saying now and build upon it in the future.
Or being an archive also to have a criticism about it, because at least I'm sure about the most of us, after this kind of discussion, we will have some lights or some points or some stakeholders about our works. But all the process that we have here and all the discussion on different points, the record and to collect, and also all our opinions in this, it's also hard to have this kind of archive or to have this kind of memory, and it's something that happened in a kind of institution that they trying to have critically about it.
No, and I think it's a challenge also for those people who are involved in critical history, radical history now. I think there are a lot of people who are doing this kind of work, right? So alternative archives. And that is not just in terms of the content of the archive, so archiving radical histories or other histories, otherwise histories, but the archive itself being radical. So how are sustained practices being reimagined, right? And what they might look like. Archives of scent, for example, right? Different kinds of sensory archives, different kinds of things. I mean, I mentioned it also. I think something like the African American Museum in the Smithsonian is in and of itself an alternative archive. The Black Archives in Amsterdam, right, is an alternative archive in that sense, right? Where a lot of immediacy makes sense in those kinds of spaces in a way that they don't make sense in the museum where I work, for example, because they have been set out to interrupt, to kind of subvert racialized time and that notion of the archive itself. So it's also about finding the spaces that already lend themselves to do alternative work. Maybe that's where your conversations need to be recorded, right? That's where those kinds of things need to go. And then also rethinking with the people who are involved in these conversations about how to do that archiving or how to make it more sustained.
Thank you.
Nice. So at the end of the night, I want to share a poem also by Scott-Heron in response to the revolution will not be televised. So he wrote this piece called in 1994, Message to the Messengers, as a reminder to the young rappers at that time about their responsibility towards their community and the world at large. And I figure it would be a good, nice closing for tonight as a reflection of our responsibility of being participants and contributors in our field of art and design. Thank you, Priya, for this lecture. Awesome. Thank you all for sticking around tonight, and we will see you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.